Everyone. Welcome to Ready, Set, Go, a webinar series sponsored by HUD's Office of Special Needs Assistance Programs, known as SNAPS. My name is Mark Allison, and I will be moderating today's webinar. On behalf of SNAPS, I would like to thank all of you for joining us. Today's webinar is CoC Program, Leasing versus Rental Assistance, Considerations when Determining How to Classify Your Project on the GIW. We will be featuring the following presenter today. Ann Oliva is the Director of HUD's Office of Special Needs Assistance Programs. She oversees the Continuum of Care, HPRP, ESG, BRAC, and Title V programs. Also, Brett Guino is with HUD's Office of Special Needs Assistance Programs. She has been instrumental in providing assistance in the development of the regulations in support of the Hearth Act. Brett will be the resource advisor who will be answering your online questions. Next slide, please. Before we begin, I would like to make a few logistical announcements. Today's webinar will last approximately 60 minutes. A recording of this webinar and the PowerPoint presentation will be posted on the Homelessness Resource Exchange at www.hudhre.info. Immediately following the webinar, you will receive a brief webinar evaluation by email. Please respond to this evaluation so we can get your thoughts on future presentations. Next slide, please. All attendee microphones are automatically muted for the webinar presentation. We recommend using your phone rather than your computer speakers to listen to today's presentation. Due to the large number of attendees, there may be a slight delay in the advancement of some of the slides. You'll hear the presenters say, "Next slide," throughout the presentation to help you follow along. Also, there's a link to the presentation slides in the chat box on your screen. If you experience any technical difficulties, you may request assistance by using the questions box in the toolbar on your screen. Next slide, please. The questions box is also the place where you can submit your content questions during the presentation. While all of your questions are important to us, we may not be able to address all of them during the webinar. Next slide, please. If we don't get to your questions, please submit them to the virtual help desk. When you do so, please reference this presentation, CoC Program, Leasing versus Rental Assistance. And next slide, please. Upon completion of this webinar, participants will be able to describe the recently added FAQs detailing leasing and rental assistance, describe the regulatory requirements for leasing and rental assistance, and identify whether a project should select leasing or rental assistance as a budget line item on the FY 2012 GIW. Next slide, please. Today's presentation will cover the following topics: characteristics of rental assistance and leasing, applying for rental assistance, administering rental assistance, and implications for the grant inventory worksheet. Now, I'm happy to introduce Ann to begin today's presentation. Ann?
Great. Thank you so much, Mark. Good afternoon, everybody. This is Ann Oliva. I'm the director of the SNAPS office here at HUD headquarters. And I'll start out with a slight apology today. This presentation is actually meant as a two-person presentation. On Tuesday, I had the pleasure of doing this webinar with our lead program counsel, but unfortunately, she was unable to attend today's webinar. So I am going to do it by myself. I'm sorry if it's a little bit boring, but Mark is going to ask you the poll questions as we go through, so hopefully that'll spice everything up. I want to start today's presentation by reminding our audience that what we're doing today is really clarifying issues related to the submission of the Grant Inventory Worksheet, or GIW. What we're not doing today is sort of taking general questions about the Continuum of Care interim program regulation, or general, questions or comments related to how we're implementing that rule and the content of that rule. What we would say to those of you who have those kinds of questions or comments is to please use the public comment process. Even though the regulation is for the Continuum of Care program is in effect, we do have it out for public comment now, and you can submit your comments via the process that is outlined on the Homelessness Resource Exchange website at www.hudhre.info. So last week, we released a series of frequently asked questions on the topic of leasing versus rental assistance. And today, I'm going to walk through that particular content with you. If you didn't have a chance to read the listserv that was sent last week, Wednesday, August 29th, I would strongly suggest that you go back and take a look at that. It did have some contextual information in it, as well as a link to the FAQs. The FAQs can be found on the Homelessness Resource Exchange, so you can reread them again. I also want to just mention a couple of things that were included in the listserv announcement. And the first is, we are not at this point forcing any project to move from leasing to rental assistance. So I think that's important for people to understand. And I don't know that we quite understood it until we understood the myriad of different kinds of setups that grantees have across the country, until we started getting questions through the help desk on the grant inventory worksheet. And what we really started to understand at that point was that a lot of projects, and today we're only talking about supportive housing program renewals that had a leasing line item. So if you're an SHP renewal that has no leasing line item, you don't need to be on today's webinar, because that's really what we're talking about, whether that should change to rental assistance. But as people started asking questions, we really saw that there wasn't, most projects don't fall neatly into one category or the other. And so we're providing some FAQs to help guide you in your decision making as you go forward through the GIW process. So again, we're providing this information as a guide, giving you some parameters to work within, but we are not forcing folks to change from leasing to rental assistance. However, if you're a Shelter Plus Care project renewal, you have always been rental assistance. That's what TRA, SRA, PRA mean. That's tenant-based rental assistance, sponsor-based rental assistance, project-based rental assistance. And you will remain rental assistance, because that has been a fairly clear set of guidance in the Shelter Plus Care program. And I think all of this is complicated by the fact that now that the supportive housing program and the Shelter Plus Care program are actually merged into the new continuum of care program, it's important to understand the distinction between sort of the activities that are consistent with leasing versus the activities that are consistent with rental assistance. So if you go to the next slide, please. Over the next series of slides, we're going to talk about a few things. First, we're going to talk about the characteristics of leasing, the characteristics of rental assistance as they are reflected in the new Continuum of Care Program interim regulation. We're going to talk about who can apply for each of these things, and we are also going to talk about who can administer those different kinds of activities. Then at the end, we're going to talk a little bit about the grant inventory worksheet and what you should be submitting to your field office. And if Lynn were here today, our program counsel, she would start out, before launching into the details around the characteristics of leasing or rental assistance, she would want to give you a little bit of background about why we're making this distinction at all. And I think it's important for our grantees to know that when we reviewed the Hearth Act, which is the law that governs this program, the Hearth Act itself uses two different terms. It uses the term leasing and it uses the term rental assistance. And what that tells us is that Congress intended for us to be doing two different things. They would not have used two different words to describe the same thing. So clearly, at this point, as we developed the regulation, we needed to clarify the line between leasing and rental assistance for our grantees and our field offices and our own staff, because Congress clearly intended to have two different activities. Again, this is somewhat complicated by the fact that we are merging the two programs, Shelter Plus Care and the Supportive Housing Program. And leasing under the Supportive Housing Program if you look at those regulations, was fairly broadly defined. So we are going from a somewhat more broadly defined set of regulations to a more specific set of regulations. So with that sort of set of caveats, let's launch into what the characteristics of leasing are. So to be considered a leasing project, the project has to have the following characteristics. The recipient or subrecipient, and that's our new words for what we used to call grantee and project sponsor, must be the tenant of the landowner or sublessor. So what that means is, in most cases, it's a landowner, but it could be somebody who has a long-term lease on a particular property. The grantee, recipient or subrecipient, is actually the tenant under leasing. The program participant or client must either be the subleasee of the recipient or subrecipient or have an occupancy agreement with the recipient or subrecipient. So in the case of permanent housing, let's say, a permanent supportive housing program that is a leasing program, let's just give an example. There is a building, and the entire building is leased by the recipient or the grantee, and they sublease to the program participant. So a lease is actually required for permanent supportive housing. An occupancy agreement can be used in transitional housing if that's the leasing setup. Next slide, please. Also, in terms of characteristics of leasing, the recipient or subrecipient must pay rent directly to the landowner. So because the recipient or subrecipient is the tenant on the lease, they're paying directly to the landowner. And it's based on actual costs. We'll talk about that a little bit more in a moment. Any occupancy charges that are imposed on the program participant are capped at the income calculation that is outlined in the regulation at 578.77. So I think that this is also really important. We've gotten some questions on the help desk about this issue. If you are a program, let's say a permanent supportive housing program that is a leasing program currently, and you don't want to have to charge rent to your program participants, you should stay leasing. Because you'll see when we talk about characteristics of rental assistance that under rental assistance, the program participants must pay rent. So rent or occupancy charges that are imposed under a leasing scenario are capped, but they are not required. Next slide, please. So also under leasing, the recipient or subrecipient is responsible for 100% of the rent or sublease to the landowner, even if the program participant does not pay the occupancy charge in a given month. So this is also different from rental assistance, and I'll talk about that in a moment. But because they are the actual tenant on the lease with the landowner, they're responsible for 100% of the rent. What that means is related to number 6, and that is the recipient or subrecipient can pay rent on a vacant unit because the actual cost of that unit is incurred regardless of whether a program participant is actually residing in the unit or not. So, you know, the caveat to that is we certainly don't expect folks to be having a large number of vacancies in their projects. So if you are leasing a 10-unit building and you're only at 50% occupancy most of the year, that's going to be a problem for a variety of reasons, but you are allowed to pay rent on those units. And then I think probably one of the most important things that people need to consider as they are going forward and considering leasing versus rental assistance is that leasing dollars do not have a match requirement. And this is the only line item in the Continuum of Care program that does not have a match requirement, and it is a carryover from the old supportive housing program where leasing did not have a match requirement on it. Next slide, please. So I've given you a broad overview of leasing. So now I'm going to turn to rental assistance and tell you a little bit about the characteristics of rental assistance. And I think an easy way to sort of think about this in your mind as you're going forward is that rental assistance is a subsidy, just similar to a Section 8 kind of subsidy. And leasing gives you much more flexibility in terms of how much of the tenant's portion you can pay. But rental assistance is a subsidy that is being paid on behalf of the program participant. So the first characteristic is that the program participant must be the sole party on the lease with the landowner or sublessor. And the other day when we did this presentation, Lynn actually gave a little bit of a caveat to this and said, we wrote this particular language before we saw some of the leases come in from grantees all around the country. And we would actually change this now to the program participant must be the sole tenant on the lease with the landowner or sublessor. It is possible to set up a lease under a rental assistance scenario where the requirements for the tenant, for the program participant, are very clearly laid out, and the requirements for the recipient or subrecipient are also laid out. There's a couple of different ways that you can set up your structure, your leasing structure under rental assistance, and we're going to be putting out hopefully some technical assistance materials on that. But in general, the program participant themselves, the client, must be the sole tenant on the lease with the landowner. The recipient, subrecipient, or rental assistance administrator must have a written agreement with the landowner or sublessor that governs the payment of rental assistance. For those of you who are used to other types of rental assistance or subsidy programs, that might be a housing assistance payments contract or a HAP contract. I just mentioned that there are some cases where a lease might have the rental assistance administrator or the subrecipient or recipient on the lease as well, as long as all of the responsibilities for each party are clearly laid out and they are in accordance with the rental assistance characteristics. That is also acceptable. So again, there must be some sort of written agreement between the folks who are administering the rental assistance and the landowner that governs the payment of rental assistance. Next slide, please. Under rental assistance, the lease should require the program participant to pay rent directly to the landowner or sublessor based on the income calculation that's in the regulation at 578.77. And basically what that says is, for those of you who are also Shelter Plus Care grantees or subgrantees, you would know that the income calculation caps how much they can pay at 30% of their income in general. So but that amount of money is paid directly from the program participant to the landowner based on that income calculation. The next one is that the administrator of the rental assistance must be a state or local government or a public housing authority. And let me just talk about a couple of issues related to this. I'm going to specifically in this presentation talk about what it means to administer rental assistance in just a moment, so don't submit your questions to Brett just yet. And we're going to talk about PHAs and how they fit into this sort of general scheme. There is one exception to this rule, and that is if there is a Shelter Plus Care grantee currently that is renewing that has a nonprofit administrator for their rental assistance, they may continue to do that because it was allowed under the Shelter Plus Care rules. New projects that have rental assistance or projects changing from leasing to rental assistance, those projects must have an administrator that is a state or local government or a PHA. Next slide, please. So this is where you get at, number 5 is where you start to get at what a subsidy is. And this is sort of, again, sort of the base of what rental assistance, the difference between rental assistance and leasing is that the recipient, subrecipient, or administrator must make rental assistance payments to the landowner based on the difference between the total rent and the amount paid by the program participant. So the program participant is paying 30% or so of their income in rent. The difference between that amount and the actual rent amount is what is paid for by the recipient or the administrator. Next slide, please. So under the rental assistance scenario, the recipient or subrecipient is not responsible for the portion of the rent that's paid by the program participant if they miss a rent payment in a given month. So under a leasing structure, you could actually pay that rent if a program participant, let's say they somehow decompensate during a particular month and something happens and you want to be able to pay their portion of the rent that month because there's an emergency. You can do that under leasing. You cannot do that under rental assistance. And in this particular case, if the program participant misses a rent payment, the landlord or the landowner could actually initiate an eviction procedure based on non-payment of rent by the tenant, regardless of whether the grantee recipient pays their portion of the rent. Next slide, please. This is another difference. Number 7 is another difference between leasing and rental assistance, and that is the recipient or subrecipient or the administrator cannot make rental assistance payments on a vacant unit except as outlined in 578.51 of the regulation. And this is actually consistent with the Shelter Plus Care program currently. And what that means is, the vacancy, you cannot continue to pay for a vacant unit because, again, rental assistance is a subsidy paid on behalf of a tenant or a program participant. And then last but not least, rental assistance does have a match requirement. So the recipient or subrecipient must provide match for rental assistance funds, and that is outlined in 578.73 of the Continuum of Care Interim Regulation. So I'm going to pause there, and I'm going to ask Mark to set us up on the first quiz.
All right, so we're going to take the next 45 seconds or so to let you register your answers to the following question. Which of the following is a characteristic of rental assistance? And you can select one of the following choices. Program participant is sole party on lease with landowner. The recipient must provide matching funds. The program participant pays rent directly to landowner, or all of the above. All right, so let's see our answers. And 90% of you got the question correct. So wonderful. Thank you. Marianne?
Great. All right. Thank you. Good job, everybody. And that means everybody's been listening closely and reading our FAQs. Again, all of those are important characteristics of rental assistance. And before I start the next section of the presentation, I just want to go back and note, Brett has asked me to clarify. I apologize. I am one of those folks that I use acronyms all the time, and I didn't clarify what the acronym PHA means, and that's a Public Housing Authority. So I apologize about that, folks. And thanks for sending in those questions. So the next series of questions, or series of slides, is really about who can apply for these activities and who can administer these activities. So first, let's talk about the easier of the two, and that is who are eligible applicants for Continuum of Care grants. And I think that, once we start talking through the difference between who is an applicant and who can administer certain activities, it will clear up some of the confusion for you. So as long as an applicant is designated or approved by the continuum of care to submit their application, the following types of organizations are eligible to apply: nonprofit organizations, state governments, local governments, or instrumentalities of state or local governments. So this is consistent with the supportive housing program. However, it is slightly different than the old Shelter Plus Care program, where only government organizations or public housing authorities could apply for the funds. And this is, in fact, a statutory change, which means it's in the law. Next slide, please. So we're going to, on the next couple of slides, we're going to break this down for you in fairly simple terms. So can a nonprofit apply for rental assistance? Under the new Continuum of Care program, the answer is yes. A nonprofit organization can, in fact, apply for rental assistance. And if you are currently a nonprofit organization that is a grantee for a supportive housing program grant, on the GIW, it is perfectly okay for you to be listed under the grantee name and have a rental assistance budget line item. For renewing supportive housing program projects, as I just mentioned, yes, a nonprofit can apply for rental assistance. For renewing Shelter Plus Care project, the answer is not applicable because a nonprofit could never have applied for rental assistance under the Shelter Plus Care program for reasons that I've already mentioned. Next slide, please. We've been getting a lot of questions in the help desk and from various organizations around the country about the role of public housing agencies, both within the continuum of care, but specifically about public housing agencies and their ability to apply for new continuum of care funds. But before I talk about this, I just want to put a caveat out there that all PHAs, public housing authorities, are not organized in the same way. Some are actually a part of the local government. Some are organized as 501c3s. Some are organized as instrumentalities of local government, and some are organized in a completely different way. So this guidance on this slide is for general purposes. However, if you really want to know how your local public housing authority fits into this general conversation, you're going to have to find out how they are organized at the local level. So again, generally, can a PHA or a public housing authority apply for rental assistance? And the answer is, for the new Continuum of Care program, a PHA may not be the applicant for a new project. That is, again, something that is reflected in the regulations. For a renewing supportive housing program project, it's not applicable because we don't actually have any PHAs that are renewing their Shelter Plus Care projects. But for renewing Shelter Plus Care projects, yes, if the Public Housing Authority is currently the recipient of the Shelter Plus Care grant, they may come in for renewal like they would in any other year. Next slide, please. Oh, we're up to the next quiz, Mark.
Yeah, thanks, Ann. So here's your next quiz. Which of the following can apply for new rental assistance funds? Please select one of the following: state governments, local governments, nonprofit organizations, or all of the above. And we'll take 30 seconds or so. Okay, thank you. Let's see the results. All right, again, I think everybody's paying attention. 81% of you answered all of the above, which is the correct response. Thank you very much.
Great. And for those of you who got that wrong, most of you chose nonprofit organizations, which are in fact eligible, but they are also not the only organization that's eligible. Local and state governments are also eligible to apply for new rental assistance funds under the Continuum of Care program. Okay, so now that you understand who can apply for the funds, we're going to talk a little bit about what it means to administer funds and who can do that under the new Continuum of Care program. Next slide, please. So, because there are now there are clear distinctions within one program between leasing and rental assistance, we are defining what it means to administer rental assistance. And here's the definition of what it means as it relates to the new Continuum of Care program. Administering rental assistance means contracting for and making rental assistance payments to the landlord. That is basically cutting the checks that go, or making the direct deposits, or however you do it locally, and conducting the housing quality inspections so that, people who are moving in, we're assured that folks who are moving in are moving into quality units. The costs related to administering the rental assistance under this particular definition are considered service delivery costs of rental assistance, and therefore you would charge that as a rental assistance cost in your project. There are other items that used to be considered the cost of administering rental assistance under the Shelter Plus Care program, what we called Shelter Plus Care rental assistance admin. And anything that is not these two items, contracting for and making rental assistance payments or conducting housing quality inspections, those costs are outlined, in most cases, in the supportive services budget. So you could actually have some of those costs in your supportive service budget. But for the purposes of the Continuum of Care program, when we say the word administering rental assistance, it means these two things, and you may charge the costs related to these two things to the rental assistance line item in your budget. So let's break it down. Next slide, please. Can a nonprofit administer rental assistance? And so can they contract for and make rental assistance payments and conduct the housing quality inspections that are needed to administer rental assistance? For the new Continuum of Care program, projects funded for rental assistance, the answer is no. And it's important, again, for you all to know that this is actually quite clear in the law, and this is not something that we made up for the regulation. This is a statutory requirement, and that's how this decision was made. So under the new Continuum of Care program, nonprofits cannot administer rental assistance. The only, again, exception is for renewing Shelter Plus Care projects. If the nonprofit is already administering rental assistance under a currently operating Shelter Plus Care project, they can continue to do so. For a renewing supportive housing program project that is changing from leasing to rental assistance, a nonprofit cannot administer rental assistance. There is, those projects that might be switching from from leasing to rental assistance, they are creating a new activity, and the new activity must be compliant with the new Continuum of Care program interim regulation. So that's why a renewing Shelter Plus Care project, you're not creating a new activity. So if a nonprofit organization is currently administering that assistance, they can continue to do so. But under the new SHP, under the new Continuum of Care program, for new projects or for renewing SHP projects, a nonprofit cannot administer rental assistance. Next slide, please. Can a public housing authority administer rental assistance? And the answer across the board here is yes. for under the new Continuum of Care program, projects that have rental assistance, a public housing authority or a PHA can, in fact, administer rental assistance. They can administer rental assistance for a renewing supportive housing program project that is changing from leasing to rental assistance. And of course, they've always been allowed and will continue to be allowed to administer rental assistance for renewing shelter plus care projects. The last bullet here is also important to note. It's about what type of agreement can a recipient have with a PHA to administer rental assistance, since a PHA is not an eligible subrecipient. And the answer here is a contract. A contract is for a service. So it's not a subrecipient agreement. It is a contract for a service, and that is the type of vehicle that would govern the relationship between the recipient and the administrator of the rental assistance. Okay, so I think we're up to the next quiz, Mark. It's a two-parter.
We are. These are the final two poll questions. The first one is nonprofits can administer rental assistance funds for new CoC projects. Please mark true or false. Okay, let's see how you did. Okay, that's wonderful. That's the correct answer. 93% of you got false.
Good job, everybody.
Yeah, wonderful. And the second question. The costs of administering rental assistance are eligible in the CoC program. Again, true or false? Okay, let's see how you did. 96%. This is a good audience. That is the correct answer. Thank you.
Good job, everybody. Okay, I don't even really have to explain those, so I'm going to move on to the next portion of the presentation, which is specific to the grant inventory worksheet. And let's go to the next slide, please. Thank you. So again, the grant inventory worksheet for FY 2012 is unfortunately but necessarily more complicated than grant inventory worksheets have been in the past. And you know, I know for those of you who might know me a little bit, you know that I was myself a grantee for the supportive housing, shelter plus care, continuum of care funds. So I know sometimes it's important to get a little context about why HUD is doing what it's doing. And one of the reasons that we're being so specific about the grant inventory worksheet this year is we are trying to help our grantees establish their baseline for the new Continuum of Care program. And because there are changes under the new Continuum of Care program from our previous legacy programs like the supportive housing program and shelter plus care, it was important to have some more detail in there. We also don't want folks to miss renewals. We no longer have the authority to really you know, help folks who forget to put their renewal projects on their list. That statutory authority that we used to have no longer exists under the Hearth Act. So it's important that we try and get our grant inventory worksheets as complete as possible and as thoughtfully presented as possible, so that we have as little, you know, as few questions as possible as we go into the application process for 2012. So if after reviewing the frequently asked questions that are on the Homelessness Resource Exchange and this webcast, you decide to move from rental assistance to leasing, there are a couple of things that we want you to keep in mind. Rental assistance and operating costs cannot be used in the same structure or unit. So projects that are transitioning from leasing to rental assistance that are 100% scattered site must eliminate the operating line item entirely. You cannot move that money to another line item. And I think that it's important. This is a very important thing to consider as you're going forward. In some cases, the rental assistance line item will be an increase from your leasing line item because it's based on fair market rent, and you will be dropping your operating line item altogether. But if there is something in your current operating line item, let's just say that you have negotiated a special deal with the landowner where you pay for something that the landowner would normally pay, and currently you use operating costs to do that. If that kind of scenario is what you're dealing with and you're thinking about moving from leasing to rental assistance, please remember that you will have to drop that operating line item. So in those kinds of cases, we would actually recommend that projects stay as leasing so that they can keep their operating line item. And we will help over the course of the next couple of months. We will help grantees and provide additional technical assistance resources for grantees to become compliant with the new rules. So that's also something that is important for folks to understand, is that we at HUD here, we recognize that at the point that you're submitting your GIW, you are not necessarily going to be fully compliant with either the leasing requirements or the rental assistance requirements. We expect that folks will become compliant through attrition as the lease terms end for their current program participants. We know it is not going to be instantaneous, and we are going to be putting out additional guidance and TA tools to help folks become compliant. So keep that in mind. Next slide, please. And in the listserv that we sent out last week, this was something that was in there that I wanted to just highlight as you're, again, thinking about moving from leasing to rental assistance. And the intended purpose of allowing a transition at this point in time through the GIW was really to allow those supportive housing program projects that were really truly operating as rental assistance projects the chance to, fix and become compliant with the rental assistance requirements under the new continuum of care regulation. It wasn't sort of intended as a free-for-all for everybody to switch from leasing to rental assistance because they wanted to. It was really intended to help those grantees that really truly are operating as rental assistants switch over now so that they are coming into the new program as compliant. And related to that, just to note, an SHP project that was funded as a new project in the 2011 Continuum of Care Competition, you cannot transition from leasing to rental assistance. Most of those projects have not actually gone to grant agreement or started operating at this point. So again, you can't be operating as rental assistance if you haven't actually started operating yet. So those projects need to be compliant with the leasing requirements when they begin to operate their projects. And that's just the FY 2011 new projects that were awarded earlier this year. So that's just a note for those of you who have those types of projects. Next slide, please. Thank you. A couple more notes. Renewal projects that are transitioning, that decide to transition from leasing to rental assistance, must document why they're doing so by providing leases to the field office before the final grant inventory worksheet is submitted in eSNAPs. The reason that we're asking for this is because we have to have documentation that shows that they are actually, that those grantees are actually operating as rental assistants. So currently operating as rental assistants. So without that documentation, we won't be able to tell whether a project is in fact supposed to be switching over to rental assistance. And we would, if leases are not submitted, we would actually just revert you back to leasing. Renewal projects that are continuing to request leasing funds, that have always had leasing funds and are continuing to request leasing funds, do not need to provide your leases to the field office. So just those of you who decide to transition from leasing to rental assistance have to do that. So with that, I think I'm going to turn it back to Mark to close us out today, unless you had some questions you wanted to ask me. Mark?
Yeah, no, I think you covered the material really well. We didn't get a lot of questions that you didn't already address in your presentation, so I think we will close it out.
Great.
Thank you very much, Ann. I'd say that you weren't the least bit boring. That does conclude today's presentation. You should now be able to describe the recently posted FAQs about leasing and rental assistance, describe the regulatory requirements for leasing and rental assistance, and hopefully identify whether your project should be leasing or rental assistance. Just to reiterate, please do complete the online survey that you'll be receiving to tell us how well this webinar met its objectives. Next slide, please. And with that, thanks so much for taking the time to attend today's presentation. Once again, if you have questions that weren't answered today, be sure to submit them through the virtual help desk and reference this presentation. Thanks again and have a great day.